The content of this video is provided for general informational purposes only, with the understanding that the speaker is not rendering specific legal, accounting, or other professional advice regarding the listener's specific legal matters. As each person's legal circumstances are different, the information discussed is not appropriate for every case and should not be used as a substitute for a consultation with a qualified legal or financial advisor. Information given may also be state-specific and may differ under the laws of the viewer's state of residence. Accordingly, Parkinson's Resource Organization and the speaker assume no liability whatsoever in connection with the use of such content. We strongly recommend that you consult your own legal counsel or other professional advisor with respect to your individual situation.
Now tonight is a treat and a half, more than a treat and a half. This man comes to all of our support groups for several reasons. Number one, I've known him longest among anyone who's helped the Parkinson's Resource Organization from the time that his daughter was about 6, 7 years old, and she's now practicing attorney with him. So that's a long time. And he's not only a really good friend, he is a very good supporter, and for you, he is the man who has the answers to questions that you really have. You have to think about them, and this is your meeting, so we're going to ask you a few to get from the start, and then I want you to make sure that you ask those questions tonight. To tell you anything more about him, he came from Glendale tonight, so he's got a 2+ hour drive to get home, so we want to make sure that we applaud him sufficiently when he's done. And I want you to know that we have to be out of here by 8:30, so you have until like 8, maybe 8:10, because they're all going to want to come up to you afterwards and ask you questions. He is in the Wellness Village. You can write to him there. You can write to him through us, or you can call him at his office. Anymore today, anyone is only a phone call or an email away. So tonight, I would like to introduce you to my good friend and our board member, William R. Remery, otherwise known as Bill or Uncle Bill to my Missy.
Wow. Unfortunately, I don't get down here often enough, and so I like to cram as much stuff as I can when I do come down here, get as much information in. But as Joe said, this is your meeting, and I want to address as many of your concerns as we can. Joe said people are going to want to come up to me later. I prefer if people have questions and stuff, if it's not too confidential, just shout them out, because probably 2 or 3 other people have the same questions, and it's a great way of answering people's questions, or things people didn't even think to ask, and it may prompt them. When I go to the support groups, and again, all the way from San Diego up through the west side, this is, I guess it's east that we're going, I try to get around to each of the support groups a couple times a year. Don't always make it, but I try. The major areas, when we actually have a sit-down lecture and we've sort of pre-done it, and this is what we're going to talk about tonight, normally in order to really thoroughly cover a subject, we'll select one. And the typical ones are like estate planning issues, trusts, wills, all the things that go along with that. And I can take up 2 hours without even hardly breathing. Substitute decision makers is a whole other area. Some of the issues of estate planning cross over. In fact, in all these areas there's a substantial crossover. But with substitute decision makers, we're talking about conservators, using powers of attorney, both medical powers of attorney and general financial powers of attorney. POLS forms, physician's orders for life-sustaining treatment, if any of you have heard of those. For those types of things are the substitute decision makers. And then Medicare plan. Medi-Cal planning is primarily a financial issue for people contemplating potentially needing long-term skilled nursing care. This is the long-term Medi-Cal program, not the community-based, at-home plan for primarily for very low-income people. This is the long-term care program where, particularly where one spouse is going to be in a skilled nursing facility, or someone will need skilled nursing and they have maybe an adult disabled child or someone else they need to prepare for and to maybe to save some money for. These are planning options, planning issues for people who may need long-term skilled nursing and are worried about the cost of it being somewhere just south of $8,000 a month. The average is about $7,600 a month. So those are the financial issues. I jotted down a couple things because I try to get around right at the beginning of the year to hit all the new laws. I don't know if you know it, but in California, laws are passed generally in the elections in the spring, and then they become effective on the 1st of January every year. So I usually come in and I do a little update on the Medi-Cal issues in the state of California, the Medi-Cal numbers. These things are both federal, both the federal estate tax and the Affordable Care Act, and just coincidentally this year we have sort of a confluence of those two things. The Affordable Care Act is coming online, and we have new federal estate tax after the fiscal cliff that sort of petered out, and everybody kind of wondered whatever happened to that fiscal cliff. I've got some answers for you. So, with all that being said, I thought I would hit on these two updates because I can cover those pretty quickly. Of the other three, is there any consensus as to where you would like me to concentrate? Anybody? Somebody, I heard earlier someone mentioned the trust. Did anybody come here with a specific question that they were hoping to have answered? Anybody?
Well, and please don't be shy, because as we said, and so Bill's trying to determine which area to go. Thank you, Lynn.
Well, we have living trusts, and it's been probably 10 years since I did mine, and Ron's is a little bit older than that, so clearly it needs to be updated. We were sort of waiting for the election and all of this nonsense. But the Parkinson's is a relatively new development for us, and I don't quite understand if Parkinson's would be any different than handling some other end-of-life
whether it be,
situation.
well, and it's not necessarily end of life, I don't think, forgive me for jumping in, but here's what I want to bring to everybody's attention tonight. Bill mentioned $7,600 a month. Does that bother anybody? Yeah, it does? So here's the question, in order to know if you want to go into some Medi-Cal planning issues tonight, or some trust, etc. area. 7,600 times 12 is what? 9,000, 90,000?
9,600 for 8,000.
96,000.
For 8,000.
So if you have $96,000 a year for at least 3 years that you can spend on care, on long-term care, and then you need some more money beyond that to take care of the well spouse, so because we don't want to deplete all of the assets. So if you don't have $96,000 a year for at least 3 years, set aside specifically for long-term care, you want to know about Medi-Cal planning. Yes. Okay, that would be one thing. If you have $3 million and you're just trying to figure out what the heck to do with that, first give it to Parkinson's Resource Center. That would be one of the things you could do. But that would be where you're concerned about estate tax. $3 million or more. Because otherwise your $300,000 or $400,000 goes pretty fast. And that's part of where you should be learning.
I'd like to see estate planning of that street, but I think based on what Bill said, maybe just some definitional enlightenment about what those other. Oh, I think I understand. So,
okay, so we have estate and a little Medi-Cal. We've got trust and.
I'd like to hear a little bit about the Medi-Medi.
Okay.
And how that interacts.
Oh, and so
and
nice to say that Medicare doesn't cover
options.
this stuff. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So the only one that I haven't heard a lot of concern about is powers of attorney and stuff like that. Is everybody pretty comfortable with that? Not too worried about that? So I'll try to focus on the other areas. If something comes up and you think of it and say, hey, yeah.
Well, I do have a question on the power of attorneys. We had a situation where a friend had ALS and knew that he only had like 6 months and he was going downhill quickly. So legally, he did all the necessary documents through Eisenhower and the hospital and so on, but he got to a long-term care facility and they didn't let him go out the way he wanted to. They still sustained his life, even though he was involved in hospice and so on. I mean, what happened?
You know what?
What went wrong with it?
That's an important enough issue that
Well,
I think I'm going to try and cover as much of this as I can. If my words start blurring together because I'm speaking so quickly, slow me down. But I'm going to lightly touch on all these areas. And then when you get to something that is of particular interest to you, or it raises a question in your mind, right while I'm there, go ahead and shout it out. Okay? In fact, I'm going to get ready for this. Okay? All right.
Serious now.
Okay. Let me cover these because they're going to be real quick. Remember, oh, I'm sorry, I'm wandering around up here, and on the filming, I'm afraid I'm having dizzy up there. The federal estate tax. The fiscal cliff, part of the gamesmanship and the brinksmanship that went on was over the federal estate tax. In 2012, we had a $5,120,000 exemption per person. In other words, a person could die with $5,150,000 would pay no federal estate tax. Federal estate tax is the tax the feds put on your estate after they lump everything together. Everything that passed through your probate estate, everything that passes under your trust, everything, a beneficiary on a bank account, a beneficiary on a life insurance policy, anything that passed when you die, whether it's inside of probate or out, they lump it all together. That's your federal gross estate. If that federal gross estate last year was over $5,150,000, the excess over that $5,150,000 would have been taxed. Okay. At the end of the year, that was going to expire. It did expire. It was a temporary fix. It was a temporary fix that lasted for 1 year, just 2012. At the end of the year, it was going to go down to $1 million. And everything over $1 million was going to get taxed starting at 40%. Okay. So they're back and forth, and some groups wanted to do away with the federal estate tax completely. Other groups were okay with raising it somewhat, but they didn't want to make it too high because you lose the federal estate tax, which in part was going to fund this Affordable Care Act. Okay. The compromise that was worked out was to make permanent the numbers from 2012, remember 5 million, but it's indexed. So last year was 5,150,000. This year it's 5,250,000. So it will go up with inflation. So the current, and they made it permanent, so the current federal estate tax amount for a single individual is $5,250,000. But there's another cool thing that they did. For people, and now we're doing some of this crossover here, and you'll see how pieces fit together. Much estate planning is sold, marketed by estate planners as tax planning. There are some sophisticated trusts, irrevocable life insurance trusts, and other kinds of trusts, which can have a tax effect, can have a tax benefit. But now, the garden variety, the 99% of trusts, which are revocable trusts, sometimes they're called living trusts, sometimes revocable living trusts, the ordinary garden variety trusts really have very little tax impact now, and here's why. The typical revocable living trust between spouses has a provision where when one spouse dies, the trust splits in two. Okay? So we have, here's the total estate. And let's say for it's $10 million. We've got a good sized estate, $10 million. One spouse dies under the default system that we have for these. They're called AB trusts or bypass trusts. We spin off as much as we can to what's called a bypass trust, sometimes the B trust. It is the trust that's attributable to the first spouse, the decedent. Okay, this is attributable to the decedent, and we lock up, if we can, the $5 million over here. So there's no tax, right? Because it's under $5 million, okay? What do we have left? We have another $5 million left. That goes over here to the surviving spouse, $5 million. And if the surviving spouse dies, there's going to be no tax. So we were able to give away $10 million by splitting the trust when the first spouse died. That was the main tax advantage of the old tax planning prior to this year, AB trusts. And if any of you who already have trusts, marital trusts, if you had any significant estate at all when the trust was drafted, it was probably drafted as an AB trust. With the new law, what they said was, you know, this is nice for people who bothered going and talking to Bill Remery about doing trusts and they set up an AB trust, but what about the rest of it? They get penalized because they didn't know enough to do this. So then, what happens? One spouse dies, and the $10 million is still sitting there. Now the second spouse dies, and the first $5,250,000 goes tax-free, and the other $4,750,000 starts getting taxed at 40%. So just for the sake of not knowing to split, it's costing you about $2 million worth of tax. Okay, so they said that there's something that just doesn't seem fair about that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to implement something called portability. Portability of the federal tax exemption. And what portability means is, when one spouse dies, any amount that's not used for that spouse gets carried over to the other spouse. So if you don't bother splitting, the surviving spouse now has $10,500,000 worth of exemption sitting there. So we have portability from the spouses. This has brought up some interesting things, and if I wasn't going to cover so much time tonight, we could toss around interesting scenarios like deathbed marriages. What if we have someone who has very little money, and we have a really wealthy person who's pretty healthy. But the wealthy person is a single person. They got $10 million, and they're worried about leaving that $10 million to their child. But they know if they die, about $2 million of that is going to go in taxes. So instead, someone who is relatively ill, they get an agreement to marry with a prenuptial agreement, so that we're going to marry, and I'll give you $100,000 just for the sake of being married. And then when that person passes away, we have portability. Now the wealthy, healthy spouse has $10,500,000 they can give to the kids with no taxes. Again, raises interesting planning possibilities, and also could make single people who don't have much money, you may have a marketable thing to
And where do we sign up?
Exactly. Okay, so that's the federal estate tax. It is now, I say it's permanent, meaning it doesn't have to be renewed every year like this nonsense. For the last 4 years we've been going through, every year holding our breath, what's the law going to be next year? This is now set and it's indexed. It's not supposed to change. Obviously Congress can change things whenever they want, but we don't anticipate they're going to play with this anymore. I think everybody's pretty much had their fill of this for a while. Okay, the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act came in 2010, and there were some immediate benefits that came up. Okay, immediately, children with pre-existing illnesses could not be denied insurance because of their pre-existing illness. They phased in, under Medicare, all of your preventive examinations, mammograms, I'm trying to think of the other, some of the other colonoscopies, all those preventive examinations. Now you get no charge once a year. You get a free exam under Medicare with your physician, no charge. The idea being, if they start doing some of this preventive stuff, in the long run, it actually saves on treatment. There were a lot of other small items that were kind of phased in over time, but the big one for us, for the Parkinson's community, comes up next January. Because as of January 1st, 9 months from now, January 1st, 2014, there is no pre-existing condition exclusion under healthcare plans. A healthcare plan cannot exclude you for a pre-existing condition and cannot rate you, cannot charge you a higher premium because you have a pre-existing condition. including Parkinson's, including Alzheimer's, including any pre-existing
And
condition.
when is that?
January 1st, 2014, 9 months from now. They'll start taking applications October 1st. So we got 6 months, about 6 months to wait. They're already working out the bugs. There are bugs. Hey, this is a work in progress. The whole Affordable Care Act is a work in progress. Much of the savings that was built in, and the General Accounting Office and other independent agencies have validated that this is a cost savings program in the long run. In the short run, it requires raising taxes on certain things and cutting back on other things. But in the long run, the idea is once everyone is in the pool, once everyone is insured, it has this leveling effect that everyone's premiums will go down to a level. Yeah.
Well, would you be eligible for long-term care then?
And that's one of those little things when I say it's a work in progress. When I started talking about this in 2011, I got all the legislative history and I went through the whole thing. I was really jazzed on the fact that they had the Class Act, okay, which was for community-based services. And wow, isn't it cool that finally they took this, you know, the bastard child of medical care, which is skilled nursing, which has never fit into any of the regular medical insurance, never fit into Medicare, and now they're bringing it all under the same umbrella from cradle to grave coverage. Well, in 2012, the GAO decided that the math that was built into it, projecting paying in a little bit to get lifetime benefits under this long-term, essentially long-term care insurance, was not fiscally sound. The numbers didn't work. And so they repealed the Class Act piece of the Affordable Care Act. I was kind of crushed, but they have come up with some alternative things that we're hoping there is still an incentive on states to get people back in the community, get them out of the nursing homes, get them into the community. So there is some federal funding and some other things to help encourage the states to move in that direction. We've always, the elder law community, elder care community, have always felt that we could take care of people better and cheaper, for the most part, at home. You reach a certain point, you got to be on a ventilator, you have really high service requirements for medical care. You really can't deliver those at home effectively for one person. It requires having a physician sitting by your side all day. We know that's not practical. A nurse, having a professional with you all the time. But for 90% of the people, they can get by with just a little bit of help at home. So instead of paying, and I threw out a number earlier, that's $7,500. It's actually, if you look on this, mine's a yellow sheet. I think with yours you got this in white. It's photocopied. There's the third number down here is called the average private pay rate. This is the average private pay rate for skilled nursing care in California in 2012. They just came out with this number because they ran the averages up through December. The average private pay rate is $75.49 a month. We said, you know what, for $75.49 a month, we can do this at home. They've had various pilot programs. They have been underfunded. They had caps. You only have 149 families in California on some of these programs. I mean, that's nothing compared to our elder care population. So they're reworking this, and again, I have hopes that somehow under this act that's going to happen, but right now there is no long-term care under the Affordable Care Act. Yeah.
How about on the tax side? Is there any ability to cut those costs?
I'm sorry?
Deduct at-home care costs?
Yeah.
There are deductions. Unfortunately, they've raised the floor a little bit on deductible expenses for itemizers at home. So that there's a higher floor that you have to pay out of your pocket before you can deduct medical costs. I think it went from like 3% to 7% or something like that. There was an increase, I know, in the floor for deductibility for those at-home costs. But once you get to that floor, you can deduct at-home medical costs. And the position, I've talked to a lot of accountants in that. I'm not a tax guy, but I've talked to a lot of accountants about this. And I've been told that as long as you would otherwise be a candidate for skilled nursing, so you're essentially certified for skilled nursing, that's like these waiver programs that the state puts up. You have to be certified for the skilled nursing by your physician. Then whatever you pay at home, which you would have paid in the skilled nursing, you can call it a medical expense for deductibility, because I have some children paying for their parents in-home care. And so, and the children, if you pay more than 50% of the parents' expenses, you can deduct them as a dependent, and that's what they do. They deduct them as a dependent and they deduct medical costs. But you got to talk to your accountant about exactly where the tipping point is on when it does you any good. The Affordable Care Act, again, part of the process or part of the system that they're trying to put in place is to make the medical system accountable in a way that it hasn't been up to this point. The pay-for-service plan that we have right now, the way we do our medical care right now, has this kind of perverse effect. The less effective, for lack of a better word, the less effective medical care you receive, the more money you spend, and the more money your physicians make. If your physician cures you with one hospitalization, they get paid for that hospitalization, that's all the money they see from you. But if you leave and you get an infection and you have to go back in, you're readmitted, they get paid twice. And there's this perverse effect. Like, is that really what we want to reward? So part of the Affordable Care Act is to come up with, and again, the arguments come up, how do we do it, and what kind of criteria do we use, but it's to come up with a protocol to measure when hospital results are good. Now, you can't help it when someone gets sick. When they go back home, they get sick. But if it's an infection after an immediate hospitalization, the hospital's no longer going to get paid. They still have to treat you, they still have to take care of you, but they're not going to get paid for that. When they have really good results under Medicare, it's not a flat rate you get reimbursed. For better results, they're going to get paid more. Again, it's a question of how we get that working consistently so that it's fair, so that everybody gets a fair shake, but that's what the plan is. That's why it's so difficult to even talk about the Affordable Care Act. All the stuff about, Obamacare and the sky's going to fall, we're in these little sound bites of hitting certain things. Oh, it's taking away your personal liberty, now I can't be uninsured. Well, so you don't have the right to have your neighbor pay for your medical care if you get really sick. And there are these arguments back and forth, but that's where the arguments were. Nobody had time on these talk shows and stuff to talk about this more sophisticated part of it, which is really the heart of the Affordable Care Act, which is to make the medical care system work in a way that makes sense in the long run. It'll take years for this to roll out, so you're not going to see major savings right now. In fact, it's going to be major costs right now. But eventually, if they get the system built in a way that you get more preventive care, and good results get rewarded, and bad results get less money, you work toward a better health care system, which ultimately is cheaper. Part of the savings from that, as it rolls out, and why it's going to take till 2020 before this happens, is every year they're closing the donut hole a little bit. They're covering more and more medicine within the donut hole, which a lot of people, elders, don't take that much medicine, that they never reach the donut hole. But for the Parkinson's community, we know what the medications run. We often hit that donut hole. For the last 2 years, you would have gotten a refund of $250 if you were within the donut hole, because they're starting to close it. And gradually by 2020, there's supposed to be no donut hole. Okay. Okay, we covered those two. Let me keep moving now. Medi-Cal planning. Okay. Mentioned the average private pay rate. People say, well, don't worry about my nursing costs because I got Medicare. I went to the hospital, it covered almost everything. In fact, I went to I had a Medicare supplement and it did. It covered my co-pays and everything. I got almost nothing out of pocket. So I'm not particularly worried if I have to go to skilled nursing. Well, I got news for you, okay? You mentioned Medi, I think. That's Medicare and Medi-Cal. You have a combination of Medicare and Medi-Cal. That's for community-based, that makes sense, and if you're at home, low income, low assets, you can use both Medicare and Medi-Cal together to cover your expenses. In skilled nursing, Medicare, if you go from home into a skilled nursing facility, Medicare pays zero skilled nursing if you go from home. If you go to an acute care facility, a hospital, and you're in the hospital for at least 72 hours, and I don't mean 71, and I don't mean 2.5 days, but if you're in there for 72 solid hours at least, and then go into skilled nursing for rehab, not just for maintenance care, but for rehab, then Medicare will pay a whole 20 days in skilled nursing. They'll pay the first 20 days if you continue to rehab. But if at any point within that 20 days you stop rehabbing, boom, your Medicare stops. Now, from day 21 to day 100, Medicare pays some, but there's a $149 a day copay. It's somewhere down here in the middle, second from the bottom. It's like skilled nursing copay days, 21 through 100, is $148 a day. So roughly, I don't know what that comes out to, probably $5,000 a month, $4,500 to $5,000 a month would be your copay. And then Medicare picks up the difference if you're continuing to rehab. The typical Medicare case is someone has a stroke or someone falls and breaks a hip. You're in the hospital for 3 days, and then you go to skilled nursing for rehab on that hip or for rehab on the stroke. If at any point your physician says, you know what, you've plateaued, you're no longer recovering anymore from this stroke, Medicare stops. They send you a notice. Now, my pitch to all my clients is when you get that notice from the nursing home, you immediately go back and say, BS, I see improvement. I see a little bit more response. I want that therapy to continue, and I'll let you know when they stop rehab. That's not just to get more Medicare days. That's to get more therapy, because it does matter. It does matter if you keep going. Same thing even with the hip and whatnot, where they say, okay, you've now plateaued. Well, blown out, you're running up and downstairs yet. I want that therapy to continue. It will have the side effect of maybe getting you a few more Medicare days, but more importantly, it's continuing to get you that.
Who makes that decision?
Well, you got to make the pitch, but you go to the doctor, and if the doctor consistently says, no, I say it's plateaued, you get a second opinion. If you really think. Now, obviously, if someone's comatose, they've had a stroke or whatever, and they're comatose, it's pretty hard to say, they're improving or they're rehabbing. But if for most people, it takes quite a while before you actually stop improving from a stroke. And again, you go into all kinds of things about strokes, taking aspirin and all kinds of stuff. Again.
Are you talking about just in terms of a long-term for skilled nursing?
That's skilled nursing.
Okay.
Since Medicare, we know, is nominal, you're not going to get much Medicare coverage. If you have long-term care insurance, that's cool. If you have Parkinson's and you have not yet gotten your long-term care insurance, I wouldn't bother. I think, unless you're going to have the kind of money for private pay, that's about what you're going to pay in your premiums. Maybe if you're a spouse of a Parkinsonian, you might think about getting long-term care insurance for yourself. And then if things get bad at home, you can kind of get worn down taking care of someone to the point to where you could actually utilize the services yourself, that both you and your spouse could sort of benefit from that money coming into the household. So it's not a bad thing necessarily to look into that. But for the Parkinsonian, once they're diagnosed, they're not going to get it again.
So the other thing is, people say, well, I've had long-term care insurance now for 15 years, or I got it when I was working 20 years ago, so I had long-term care. Understanding that policy is also very important, because I just ran into a situation where the long-term care insurance covered the care for a person, but did not cover the rent in case it went to a care facility. So you have to understand what your long-term care policy says. So if they're covering the care and not the rent, then they're not covering a facility.
Particularly the older policies, they were kind of hit and miss, some good, some bad. They've gotten somewhat more uniform because of the abuses. They have now certain laws, there are certain mandatory minimum things that all long-term care policies have to have, and the insurance director of insurance and stuff will make sure that the policy is covered. But they do differ. They can have lifetime benefits. They can have a limited time benefit. They could have a cap per day. They could have a cap, lifetime. They're all different kinds of provisions for long-term care policy, so you need to look at them carefully. But if you have one, cool. That may be a way of funding your long-term care, but again, to have a policy that pays $7,549 a month, that's a pretty expensive policy. Most policies, you get them, maybe they're indexed up for cost of living and stuff, and you're talking in the in the $3,500 a month, $4,000 a month areas. That's not enough to private pay. You do understand with most long-term care policies, you are going to have to subsidize that policy in order to actually pay for skilled nursing care. So, but if you have no long-term care policy or not enough insurance or it has run out, Medicare is not going to cover you. You've got two other alternatives. One, pay out of your pocket, and we know the numbers. The other alternative is long-term Medi-Cal. It is the federal Medicaid program administered by the state. So it's a state-federal joint program. The state, because we're the Hollywood state, we call everything after ourselves, we call it Medi-Cal. Most states call it Medicaid. It's the same program. But each state administers it a little bit differently. In Arizona, they have what's called Access, Arizona Cost Containment System. They get a block grant. They don't participate under the regular Medicaid program. They get a block grant and they just deal with their whole thing as a single payer insurance plan. We're moving that way in California because now most of Medi-Cal people are assigned to like Kaiser or they're assigned to one of the group plans. They just found it's more efficient. But so state by state it's administered a little bit differently, and the numbers I'm going to talk to you about in a minute differ from state to state. So if you're talking to your relatives in Minnesota, don't quote these numbers. The system works more or less the same. Some states permit certain transfers, some states don't, so it's applied a little bit differently, but the general rules are the same. And here's the thing. With long-term Medi-Cal, the key to qualifying, first of all, you have to be eligible for long-term skilled nursing care. Skilled nursing care. It does not pay for boarding care. It does not pay for assisted living. It does not pay for at-home care. Except for those waiver programs that I told you we're hoping to come online. And maybe next year I'll come tell you about some great new program they have. Right now, I could grind away for 2 hours on the different waiver programs, but so few people actually qualify for them and stuff that it's hardly worth the time. So for our purposes now, long-term Medi-Cal doesn't cover for at-home, assisted, or boarding care. Okay? So the first thing is you got to need skilled nursing. The second thing, and that skilled nursing means you have a medical need that requires skilled nursing or dementia to the point where you have to have 24-hour supervision. Having qualified medically for the program, then you have to qualify asset-wise. And this, a lot of people get confused in this because they mix up their income with their assets. Okay. The first thing to get your foot in the door is you have to qualify asset-wise. Once you qualify asset-wise, then you can move to the next step, looking at your income to say, okay, now I qualify for the program asset-wise, how much should I be paying toward this out of my income? But we don't even get to that. You can have no income at all coming in. It just doesn't matter if you have a penny too much of assets. And here's what happens. And it gets a little confusing because we in California is one of the 9 community property states in the Union. Okay, so we talk about community property. Remember, this is really a federal program, and federally they don't know from community. Most of the country is under equitable distribution and under just the old common law marital rights. We have community property out here. So the feds, under this Medicaid program, talk about community and community spousal resource allowance. They're not talking about community property. They're talking about the spouses living in the community. Okay? So please don't get confused with the terminology. Okay, so the first thing is we're going to look at all the assets, and I'm going to start with a married couple. In the bad old days, just before Reagan left, this law was changed. It was one of the last laws that Reagan signed into law. It changed the Medicaid program. Under the old system, we could separate out the two spouses' assets, spend down one spouse's assets, and they'd qualify for Medi-Cal. And the other spouse could keep their assets. And what could they keep? They could keep their half of the community property, plus all of their separate property, because that's the way our family law rules are written in California. You get to keep all your separate property, which is what you had prior to marriage, or what you get by a gift or a bequest during the marriage, plus half of your community property. Okay? They collapsed all that and said, no, well, first of all, before that, and when I first started practicing 33 years ago, both spouses had to be down to $3,000 total for either spouse to get any Medi-Cal. So the at-home spouse had to be down to $3,000 of countable resources before the other spouse could get any Medi-Cal. Then we got to the system that I was telling you where, okay, we were telling people to get divorced, because in a divorce you can keep your half of your separate plus your half of the community. Well, when the legislature finally caught on that we were having to divorce their grandparents so that we didn't impoverish grandma, they sort of woke up and said, oh yeah, you know, that it kind of doesn't make sense to force people to actually get a divorce. Why don't we just let them do it on paper? Let them do a severance agreement where they split, just like if they had a prenuptial agreement, split their assets and let the healthy spouse keep their separate community and spend on the rest, and that's the deal. Then Reagan came in and said, nah, we kind of don't like that because that's letting some wealthy spouses keep their separate property. If they were wealthy before they got married, that's all separate property. They get to keep it, and then the other spouse goes on Medicare. We don't think so. So the system they came up with is, we're going to put everything in the pot. Okay? We're going to put everything in the pot. And so let's start with just a few assets here. We've got a house, let's say. And I'm going to need to drive this out, waving it around. Okay, so we got a house, and a car, and a boat, okay, and an IRA, and savings, cash, and some stock, and an annuity. Anybody think anything else right offhand?
But did they just have one house where the snowbirds live, so...
Okay, second home. Okay, anything else right offhand? Okay, let's start with this. So I said we're going to lump everything together. Now we're going to pull out stuff we don't count. Okay? Stuff we don't count. These are exempt resources. We're not going to count one house. Doesn't matter whether it's the Taj Mahal or a trailer. One house, you live in it, it's theirs. Houseboat, you live in a houseboat. So if you're living in it, it's a residence, we're not going to count it. We're not going to count one car. It used to be a luxury car issue because, you know, luxury cars were not exempt. They took that away. So you can have the Maserati, one car. IRAs are interesting. Anything that is considered a pre-tax pension plan or pre-tax pension savings, they're going to treat as income because they're expecting you to draw down on it. They're going to count it toward cash flow, and they're not going to count the principal amount that's in there. So for our, and remember I said initially we have to count, you know, do asset-wise. As long as the IRA is either in the name of the healthy spouse, they don't count it whether you're drawing out on it or not. And if it's in the name of the ill spouse, you have to be drawing out on it over your life expectancy. So as long as the ill spouse is drawing out over the life expectancy, or it's in the name of the healthy spouse, we're not going to count that IRA. So now we got a house, a car, an IRA. The same thing happens with the annuity, but for the annuity, it has to be both in the healthy spouse and ill spouse. If they have an annuity, you have to start drawing out on it because you converted it from an asset into cash flow. So they won't count it as long as you have cash flow out of it. The boat, they're going to count it unless you're living on it. The stock, they're going to count it just like cash. Cash is cash. The second home, they're going to count the second home, but here's an interesting thing, and this is unique to California. So if you talk to people back east, you know, they're going to think you're nuts. Because it's kind of a nuts system, frankly. We've expected them all along to change this because it's kind of a little loophole, but it works and you follow the rules, you get it. They value real property in California at its assessed value. Through the rest of the United States, that makes perfect sense because they keep revaluing things as it goes up and down, but we have Prop 13. So I have a couple of cases right now going on where I have clients who have like these little things up in Big Bear that they bought, you know, 50 years ago for, you know, for almost nothing. Their tax bills are, you know, are this big, so they're valued at, you know, like, you know, on the tax rolls at $7,500 or something like that. But they're nice little cabins up there, you know, livable things. So this house, although if you keep it, as far as they're concerned, it's only worth $7,500, right? Because that's the assessed value. And interestingly, you get the lesser of assessed value or fair market value if you want to have it appraised. And if you can appraise it lower than $7,500, you can actually get the appraised value. But for our purposes, normally it's the assessed value is the lower value. And they take off of that number anything you owe against the property. So, if you actually, let's say it was worth $75,000, and you just take out a little equity loan against it, a little $75,000 equity loan, you can actually zero that out so that you can hold on to it. It would not count against your accountable resources. Okay. I don't want to spend too much time. Okay, we're trying to cover too many areas. So what happens then is after we get all the stuff out that is exempt, they let the applicant, the ill spouse, keep an applicant reserve of $2,000 of countable stuff. $2,000 in cash can be in the applicant's bank account, or they can keep a tenth of a crew grand in their pocket or something. So the applicant gets $2,000. That's been $2,000 since the 1980s. It has not been indexed up. In the 1980s, 2,000 actually was not a bad sum of money. You could actually even make a little dent on a burial plan, but nowadays, hardly even worth mentioning. The healthy spouse, community spouse, gets this top number. $115,920. So the healthy spouse gets about $116,000 of anything. That $116,000 can be partly the boat, it can be partly the cabin, it can be partly some stock, some cash. They can make it whatever they want it. So there are mechanisms for married people to move assets around and change assets to get asset-wise. For a single individual, there is no community spouse at the top, so by the time we pull out all the stuff in here, this better be down to $2,000, or the applicant is simply not going to qualify. Now, getting a single person qualified here usually involves, instead of with a spouse, you can, again, move assets. Maybe you have extra cash, put it into the house. Maybe the house needs a new roof. Maybe the house could use a new bathroom, a new kitchen. So you can put what would otherwise be countable resources into a non-countable asset. An ill person can have a house and can have a car, and it won't count toward their $2,000. But once they're in a nursing home, they're not going to have enough money to take care of it. So it's kind of a problem. So they need to think about an arrangement, whether somebody's going to live in there, whether they're going to rent out, what's going to happen, how are they going to keep that house. The other gotcha is for a single individual, if the single individual keeps the house and gets on Medicare, that's fine as long as they're alive. When they die, that's no longer their residence. Since it's no longer their residence, it's no longer an exempt resource. So Medi-Cal now can assert a claim for reimbursement. So it's kind of leaving it there as a sitting duck. So you've got kind of a loan from Medi-Cal. Now there's still an advantage of doing that in the sense that if you pay Medi-Cal reimbursement, you'll pay much less than private paying from the get-go. And it's a tax-free loan. So if you have relatives or somebody who are not that concerned about it, you could rent the house out and just maintain the house, even if you have to repay Medi-Cal later. But you'll be repaying a much lower amount interest-free, so you have an interest-free loan all that time. So it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but there are other options, particularly if you have kids, because it's an exempt resource, because we don't count it, you can also transfer it. So you can transfer it to a child or whatever. And so, again, there's planning options here. I don't want to waste too much, not waste, but I don't want to spend too much time on this. Once we get the asset picture correct, then we go to the income side. On the income side, that's how much of your money are you going to have to pay toward your own care. If you're a married couple, you take your combined incomes. So I'm just, for the sake of throwing some numbers up here, I'll say we've got $1,800 Social Security for one spouse. Usually the non-working spouse, assuming there was a non-working spouse, would get about half of what the working spouse got, so I'm going to put $900 in here for the non-working spouse. Maybe we've got a pension, let's say a $2,000 pension. Again, working spouse has the higher Social Security. And then we were talking about an annuity earlier, so maybe we've got $500 a month coming in an annuity. Okay, so on this side we've got $4,300 a month coming in here, and $900 a month coming in over here. Okay. If this is the ill spouse, you see on the chart here, the applicant personal needs allowance is $35 a month. Like the $2,000 figure, that's the figure that's been here since the 1980s. So the applicant gets to keep $35, which we used to call cigarette money, but we don't do that anymore. Okay? And what's left is $865 over here. If we don't do anything, or let's say there is no spouse, we just have a single individual, and that's all the money they have. This will be their share of cost. this will be the money they get to spend every month, $35. You can see they can't be supporting a house or anything else out of this kind of money. That's why you need to make other alternative plans if they're going to keep any other assets. Now let's get back to the marital situation. The marital situation, you get the same thing because the healthy spouse never has to pay money to support the ill spouse once they qualify asset-wise for Medicare. So, the healthy spouse here could keep the full $4,300. The ill spouse will pay the first $865 toward their care, and you have $35 to spend. If this person needs another $865 a month to live because they've got a huge mortgage payment and other costs at home, they can actually go to court. Now, you can't go to Medicare, they're not going to give you any more money. But you can go to court and get a spousal support order, either in family court or probate court, there's two ways of doing it, and ask the judge, say, Judge, this person is completely taken care of under Medicare. I need this other $865 to live. Here's my budget. And they can actually get that $865 over there. Okay? Now, let's switch it around though. This is the ill spouse. Okay, now we've got a problem here because we've got $900 coming in over here and $4,300 coming in over here. You say, well, we know that the healthy spouse can keep all of their income. They need a lot more than their income. Isn't Medicare going to give them any break at all? And the answer is yes. And that is the second number down here, 2898. These numbers, the first, second, and third numbers are indexed every year. And the second number here is the minimum monthly maintenance needs allowance, MMNA. This is the minimum amount that a healthy spouse is allowed to keep. Yes?
Is what you're talking now California law?
California.
Okay.
Different states have different numbers. We've always maxed out what the feds would permit. California has always given us maximum benefits. Other states, and it's no. Remember this $115,000 figure up there? That started at $60,000. That was $60,000 when this was first passed by Reagan, and you can see how indexing up. It's now up to $116,000. So the healthy spouse, they say, should get at least $28.98 a month. Okay. So what they'll do is they'll take enough money from here to make the total $28.98. Again, time, I'm not going to bother doing the math. It's roughly $900. So they're going to allow you roughly $2,000 over here to bring this person up to $28.98. So if we had, well, I can do it here. Okay, it's $2 less, so it'd be $1,998. Then this one is going to be $2,000 less. So this is going to be down to $2,300 over here. So if we didn't do anything else, this person gets $35, and their share of cost would be $22.65. Okay, they pay the first $22.65 of their nursing cost. Medi-Cal pays the balance, and this spouse over here will have $28.98. But again, as I told you, if this person needs more than $28.98, we can get as much of this as you need over here, up to the whole amount. So we can shift the whole amount over here, so this person has $5,200 a month to live. Okay, that's the income stuff. Now, we talked about this annuity over here. This is why certain annuities, remember I said annuities are exempt? So one of our planning devices is sometimes we take the excess cash, which is not exempt, CDs sitting in the bank generating no interest, and put it into an annuity, which is exempt. They're going to count this $100,000 if it's sitting in a bank account, but they're not going to count it if it's in an annuity. So we take it out of the bank account and put it in an annuity. If the annuity is in the name of the healthy spouse, it makes sense because the healthy spouse gets to keep all the income coming in their name. But if the annuity is in the name of the ill spouse, it's kind of silly because all you're doing is you're just increasing how much you're going to pay to the nursing home. However much money comes in from the annuity, that's just more money you're going to pay to the nursing home. So annuities can be an effective planning device, but not always. Okay, we're running out of time a little bit. I want to get to a little bit of estate planning stuff. Anything else before I leave that? Okay.
Did we find that interesting?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, estate planning. I already talked about how the AB trust stuff works. Now, remember, I said almost all of you who have marital trusts predating 2013 or 2012 for sure, you probably have an AB trust. Now, when I create AB trusts, I still use them, but I don't fund them. I say when one spouse dies, unless they want to split, you can keep it all on one side because with portability, we're not worrying about taxes. but they have the option of disclaiming it into this deed trust if it makes sense later, because we don't know what the laws will be then, and there might be other reasons to fund that other trust, like take care of stepkids. Remember, with our blended families now in California, his kids and her kids and their kids, and maybe there's a concern that when one spouse dies, the share that's attributable to that spouse is going to find its way to some new spouse, or some new stepkids or something, going to cut out the first spouse's stepkids, or first spouse's kids. And there are other social reasons why you might want to make those changes. So that's just the basic AB trust issue. With estate planning, the key is to figure out what are you trying to accomplish. Okay. You could be trying to save taxes, and I told you that these trusts don't really do much for taxes anymore. You could be trying to avoid probate, which is not a bad thing to do. Avoiding probate is where you go to court and you have a judge look at your estate, say, are all the bills paid, collect all these assets, divide these according to what you said in your will, or if you didn't make a will, divide these assets how the legislature said you wanted it. People don't realize everybody's got an estate plan. A lot of people, I've never made a will because I don't have an estate plan. Oh, you got one. You didn't know it, but you got one. The legislature said you got one. And it's kind of logical. It follows what you would normally think. Some goes to the spouse, some goes to kids. Just real quickly, all community property, all property earned with effort during the marriage, would pass to the spouse. Nothing goes to kids. Separate property, property you had prior to marriage, or property you got by gift or bequest during the marriage, goes partly to the spouse, partly to the kids. If you have one child, it goes 50-50. If you have more than one child, it goes 1/3 to the spouse, 2/3 divided among however many kids you got. Okay, that's the default for separate property. If there are no children, your separate property goes half to the spouse, half to the parents or siblings of the deceased spouse. So it leaves the marital estate completely.